Okay, well, I think we'll get started. Thanks again for coming to another one of the Department of Education Reform's lectures as part of our lecture series. This is our second to last lecture for this academic year. Next week, I believe, we will, no, it's in 2 weeks. In 2 weeks, we'll have our final lecture where Stewart will be here to talk about what's sometimes described as acting white, and if that phenomenon exists, and if so, what can be done about it. But today we're going to be hearing from Tom Stewart. Tom and I actually go way back, where we were students together at Harvard, and in fact, Tom is the first graduate of the University of DC to receive his PhD from Harvard. Following receiving his PhD, Tom worked, he received one of the prestigious Harvard Society of Fellows, and he also spent time founding a boarding charter school called SEED, which I believe was profiled on 60 Minutes, wasn't it? Yes. And he also helped found a for-profit education management company called Learn Now, which was later acquired by Edison Schools, and he was a senior executive at Edison Schools for a period of time. He left Edison Schools to form his own consulting efforts in what's called symphonic strategies. Symphonic strategies. And yet, during all this time working in education, in applied settings, Tom has also been actively involved in research, including working with our own Pat Wolf on the school choice demonstration project, evaluating the effect of school choice in DC. And here today, we're going to listen to Tom talk about the connection between community and school. And look forward to hearing Tom's comments and your questions after. Thanks, Tom.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Jay, for the introduction, and thank you all for coming out. I think my introduction to the University of Arkansas ironically began last night as I rushed to make a flight to the University of Arkansas. I flew from Baltimore to Memphis, and while taking a very, very long walk with about 15 minutes to make the connecting flight, I stumbled across what appeared to be a fabulous barbecue restaurant. So I stopped in a restaurant, and they were literally closing the doors by the time I got to the plane. But when I arrived on the plane, I sat on the first row. There was a wonderful woman seated next to me on the plane who offered to hold my sandwich because my hands were full. And I don't think she knew this, but I was very, very reluctant to let her hold the sandwich that I'd almost missed the flight for. But I let her hold it and put my stuff in the overhead bin, and she gave it back. And then she was very hospitable throughout my time on the plane. She offered me her seat. At some point, she noticed that because I have long legs and we were in a very cramped seating situation, that maybe I would want the seat near the window. I didn't take it. I dozed off, woke up, and she offered me the seat again. And I said to myself, and then eventually to her, "Where are you from?" And she says, "Fayetteville." And I said, "Oh, that's interesting." I said, "All people in Fayetteville as nice as you." And she said, "They certainly try to be." And we went on to ironically have a conversation about why I am visiting Fayetteville, and come to find out she too is in the education department in general. She focuses on a lot of issues that involve my areas of interest, namely around leadership. Beverly Elliott. And so it's a very small world. So when I got off the plane, Jay greeted me, and the first thing I said to Jay, "Is this some kind of setup?" There's no way somebody can script this kind of experience. But she turned a 45-minute trip into about 10 minutes because we had a wonderful conversation, and I'm glad you could be here today, Beverly, as well as all of you. And essentially, today I'd just like to share with you all some experiences I've had as I've attempted to, when I left grad school, and I know there are quite a few grad students in the room, and I think I'd like to kind of focus my presentation to some extent on, kind of how you find yourself, moving from one kind of professional pursuit to someplace you might not imagine. And my career really began in grad school with a dissertation on prisons. And I came from a neighborhood in D.C. in which I later discovered had a disproportionate number of the males who end up spending some time incarcerated. And I always wondered, what that experience did to them. And so when I had an opportunity, when you reached the writing phase of the dissertation experience, the PhD experience, I chose to pursue this institution, which I didn't think was getting a lot of attention in our department, which was, we call it government, but it's traditional political science. And I wanted to understand how this institution came to be, how it impacted, at that point, their political attitudes and beliefs, and more importantly, as a result of having their political attitudes and beliefs altered somehow, how would that somehow go back into the community? And I call it an exportation model, that they would import something into prisons and they would export something back to their families and their communities. And eventually I stumbled into education. And so, the road to actually giving this presentation today has been one that's been more, I think, fate than kind of conscious pursuit. And so what I appreciate about speaking today and my preparation over the last few weeks, I thought about the many, many topics I could share with you all. But the one I think I settled on was a topic that allows me to share what it's been like to be a practitioner who has a scholarly bent, who eventually wants to be a scholar with more of a practical bent. And so I think, I'm at that point in my career, as Jay mentioned, and I'll share a little bit more detail about some of the things that I've done. But there are a couple questions I have for you all before I get started. And one is, just a few people, what did you think you would get today, or kind of what you hope to leave with? Yeah, just random. Anybody?
Lunch.
That's a good one. Anybody else want to throw out something? Okay.
Go ahead.
All right. Well,
The secret to success in leading urban schools.
The secret to success in leading urban schools. I can guarantee you won't get that.
What is the mix of responsibility for educational outcomes between in-school and out-of-school factors?
Okay, that's a good one. One thing you all should know, and some of you may have realized this today, is Friday the 13th. I once gave a talk, and a portion of the room, the ceiling caved in on Friday the 13th. So I thought some of you may have known about that, and obviously you didn't, because you wouldn't have come if you did. But I like to think that I brought the roof down that day. But and so I thought maybe some of you heard about that, and that's why you came out, because I brought that roof down. Second question I have for you really quickly is these hands. What kind of symbolism, what kind of thoughts, reactions, when you look at those symbols, do you all have? Just a couple reactions.
Reaching.
Reaching for anything in particular, you think?
I want their teacher to call on them.
Teacher to call on them. Let's go.
Trying to get out.
Trying to get out. Any idea what they're trying to get out of? If you had to let your imagination continue to kind of move in a certain direction.
Well, they're all in boxes.
Okay. Well, one of the things that I try to be very mindful of through my practical experiences is that, though for the most part we're going to be talking about adult-related matters, the issues that are at play around education reform in America are related to children. And for me, one of the things that I would share with you all about me that you would not know in kind of reading my CV and anything Jay may have mentioned or you may have found out through some other source, is that I was the consummate underachiever. Neither of my parents have high school diplomas. I never had any desire to go to college. I had a military experience that really kind of altered my life. And when I arrived in undergrad at about the age of 22, they told me I was reading and writing at a 9th grade level. So I had to take about 1.5 years of remedial courses before I could enroll at the University of the District of Columbia. And I fell in love with learning. And when I reflected upon my experiences as a young person, I realized that something else happened, and it was in big part reflected. I would never raise my hand. I would, in no class setting prior to probably my mid-20s, and I think even in grad school, I still had some trepidation about my academic abilities, and I like to think that I've grown out of it in big part. But for me, whenever I go into, and I've been in and out of hundreds of schools over the last few years, you know, people want to show you standardized test scores. They want to show you other examples of the fact that children are learning and are producing positive outcomes. But for me, the symbolism here is when I go into a classroom, I look for the number of young people who raise their hands. And typically, when I'm a guest, I'll throw out some question like I did to you all, and for a different reason, though. And I would say, you know, something, and I'm looking at their eyes, and it's going to be reflected in whether they raise their hands or not, whether this is the kind of learning environment that they should be in. So the big question for us today is, how can we improve academic outcomes for all students, particularly those from low-income and disadvantaged environments? And as I mentioned, when I've gone into those kind of places, raising the hands is a big way that I kind of measure it. So throughout the presentation, I like to have this kind of symbolism because, like I said, we'll go off on a tangent. We'll be talking about a lot of adult-related issues, but I don't want us to forget throughout this experience that it's about raising your hand. And what raising hands mean for me, it symbolizes confidence. One beautiful experience I had was with an organization right outside of Boston called the Efficacy Institute. It's headed up by a guy out of Chicago named Jeff Howard. And Jeff is a social psychologist by training. And he's just done a phenomenal job of understanding that confidence, student confidence, is the root to failure or success. Confidence or the lack thereof. And he goes on to say a lot of other things. And there's another wonderful scholar that I follow her work, and some of you may be familiar with her. Her name is Carol Dweck. And she quite recently wrote a book called Mindset. And Carol's work is really interesting. It's kind of the flip side of Jeff's, because Jeff's work focuses a lot on disadvantaged, underachieving students. Carol's work focuses on high-achieving students, and how you go from being a high-achieving student to a failing student. And she believes that a lot of that happens, ironically, at the university level. There are a lot of very high-achieving students that come out of high school. In many cases, they're the valedictorian or somewhere near the top of their class. And some of you have probably met those people. First, second year in college, they get gobbled up. And if it doesn't happen in college, it happens in grad school. And I tell people all the time, I thought grad school was about mental hazing more than anything else. And so confidence follows you throughout life. And the beautiful thing about Carol Dweck's work is Carol helps us to understand why high-achieving students continue to be high achievers versus high-achieving students who become lower achievers. And she believes it has everything to do with the mindset. And high-achieving students who maintain that are focused on the process of learning. High-achieving students who become failing students focus on the outcome. So at any point, if they don't have the outcome that's supposedly correlated with their intellectual abilities, then they give up. And then you give up, you fail. The other part of raising your hand is about excitement and enthusiasm around learning. And I've been in so many academic settings where that has been lacking sorely. And so a big part of education reform has to be about creating very exciting learning environments, not only in school, but in a lot of other places. And the last thing, and I think the thing that hampered my development prior to 22 more than anything else, was being in an environment that I didn't trust. being around people I didn't trust. And most of the people I didn't trust weren't the teachers, even though they had some part in it, but it was my peers. And I grew up in an environment where if you were called on, you typically had some kind of negative reaction to the teacher because you did not want to be exposed. You didn't want to be called a dummy or stupid or some of the other things that we jokingly call one another on the playground, not knowing that these are emotionally devastating names to call someone. And that's a beautiful thing about Jeff's work, is he just talks about a lot of the language that we have to eliminate from the vocabulary of our young people because it's very destructive language. But when you add all those things up, I should also mention to you that one of the research methods that I personally use to kind of think about scholarship from a very personal level is a method called heuristics. And I don't know, once again, for the grad students, maybe even some undergrads here, I think as you transition into doing or exposing yourself to more rigorous methodologies, heuristics is a really good stepping stone in that direction. Because once again, in grad school, I made a big leap from historically black institution that had historically not sent anyone to Harvard. And then I go to Harvard, representing, and then that's on one level, it was a lot of fun. On another level, it was extremely overwhelming. And Jay would tell you in some of the seminars that we were in, it's only 6 or 8 people. You have 2 or 3 faculty members. You're going to be there for 2 or 3 hours. You can't hide. Either you know it or you don't. And so I grew up pretty quickly, and it was a very painful growth process. But the point that I want to make is that prior to having those kind of experiences, you can work your way into preparation. And with heuristic methodology, you basically look at your own experiences. And I've kind of given you some examples. When I talk about prisons, it was a very salient institution in my neighborhood, though I did not have a direct experience with it. And so part of using heuristics and my dissertation was not only did I learn something about this institution that is an American-made institution, prisons did not exist anyplace else before America. I learned a lot about myself, and I felt really fortunate in terms of some things that I didn't have to experience. So throughout my presentation, heuristics is the methodology that I'm using to give this presentation, and once again, that's why I really am thankful that I've been invited to do it, because it's forced me to look inwardly as much as it appears that I'm looking outwardly. A few experiences that I had that I should share with you. Jay mentioned a school called the Seed School. Seed is the 3rd public charter school that is residential. And the first one was in Boston, and it didn't last very long because essentially it was a charter school concept that was used to bring in mostly delinquent children. And it's sponsored founded by the Department of Human Services, and it just never got off the ground. And then the second school was a school right outside of Trenton, and that school didn't last very long because they just really weren't well prepared. And within a span of about 2 years, going back from 1998 to about 1997 to 1999, Seed was founded in 1998, and we were very, very fortunate because funding, the skies opened up, and Oprah Winfrey, Bill Gates, a lot of people have made huge donations to the school, and that started from the day that we started to raise money. And it's a challenging concept. We had a brief conversation a little earlier with a couple people over lunch, and the problem with a school like Seed, per pupil funding in the first couple 3 years is somewhere around $40,000 to $45,000. And there's not a lot of people who are willing to make that level of investment in essentially young people who come from what I call tenuous backgrounds. And we would basically recruit 6th graders, and we would go into some of the more depressed areas of the city, and we would send a message directly to the young people. And we would say to them, if you're not getting 3 square meals a day, if you're not going to bed at 9, 10 o'clock at the latest, if somebody is touching you inappropriately or doing something you know they shouldn't do, we want you to consider our school. And we would give them flyers. And about 90% of our first year class, when we talked to the adults, we said, how did you find out about the school? My son or daughter brought this flyer home. And some of the kids, many of them, did not come from that kind of situation, but they liked the notion of a boarding school. Because the other thing we said to put a really positive spin on it was, it's essentially going to college in the 7th grade, as opposed to waiting until you graduate from high school. So that stuck with a lot of them. But the bigger point I want to make about Seed is that for the first time in my life, I could have an out-of-body experience in looking at young people who came from a very similar background. When I was from 7 to 9 years old, I was in foster care. This finger became badly infected. Teacher put a note on my shirt saying to my mother, father, that I should have it looked at. The next day I came back, the same clothes on. The note was on my shirt. The teacher reported to a social worker. My sister and I, at the end of class, were taken into a large foster care facility. The next day my parents were summoned into court. They were declared unfit parents, and we spent 2 years in foster care. Another really interesting wrinkle about why I like boarding schools. I'd spent for 2 years my life in an open bay with like 30 other boys, well 29, 30 of us in the room, but 29 other boys. And that really was just another personal experience that I had from a heuristic standpoint that has just followed me throughout my life. So to be with 40 other young people, 20 boys, 20 girls, for 2 years and spend literally every waking moment of their day with them gave me extraordinary insight into Jay's question to some extent as to how do you create this kind of holistic experience that has a lot of continuity between in and out of school time. But given the cost, there's no way you can replicate something like that and get a lot of people across the country excited about it. So for me, moving on to school management was like the next logical step in the process. And our goal in the school management business was to build math, science, technology-focused high schools in every depressed area of the country that somebody would be willing to host us and partner with us to build a school. And then subsequently, that company, which is called Learn Now, we were acquired by Edison Schools, which is the leading private manager of public schools. But the combination of experiences gave me kind of a broader, Seed was deep in terms of giving me some understanding. Those school management companies were broad because we had to learn and grapple with the politics of starting a new school, the politics of competing with an existing school that often is failing and has been historically failing children in the neighborhood, and we come along and said we want to do something else. We learned quickly that we're offending parents that graduated, grandparents, several generations of a family that went to that school that we're now calling failing, and we're now bringing in another school possibility or option that could compete with them and potentially put them out of business. Those are a lot of the politics that are at play when we're simply talking about schools. But I think the more unique experience I had around it that I want to share with you all today is that my job was a very schizophrenic job. I was a senior executive, and I would have to often, with a small team of people, go into a neighborhood or community, and we would have to convince them to partner with us. And one of the things, and I'll share more with you about this in a little while, is that one of the, I think, the biggest imbalances in education reform, as I've come to understand it, is what I simply call supply and demand. A lot of what is at play around education reform is called, for me, it's supply side. You're talking about, and Beverly and I were talking about this last night, you talk about teachers and principals and other administrators. A lot of school-based personnel are the ones that get a fair amount of resource and training, and certainly there's room for improvement, generally speaking, in those areas. But compared to the demand side, which are the parents and other community members that have to buy the product, hold whoever produces the product accountable, in this case for quality academic outcomes, it was sorely lacking. So I would go in, and I'm talking to parents and community members who just really aren't ready to have a conversation about their child, in some cases, let alone building a major institution like a school. So I would essentially have to spend a fair amount of time getting them up to speed around what they should be looking for in somebody like us. And I often felt that if they were really sophisticated, in many cases they wouldn't even bring us in or even consider partnering with us. But in almost every case they would. And that was tough because within my companies, nobody wanted to hear me say that I'm out there educating parents to potentially buy another product, or community members to buy another product, because so much of what I would initially have to do is give them a framework for thinking about and assessing the viability of what we had to sell. And a little later on in that process, I became a co-founder of I think one of the most significant education reform organizations with a national focus on African Americans called the Black Alliance for Educational Options. I'm a founder of it, co-founder, and I sat on the board for a couple of years. And BAO, once again, was another lens into this issue, helped me to understand why I was conflicted. Because BAO does a combination of both. And for the first time, I was around people that were doing the education piece. And we talk about choice and options. So in school reform, you all have probably heard a lot the notion of choice. And sometimes it was used to encompass both supply and demand. And one of the arguments that we made in creating BAO is that choice is the demand side of the equation. That's the parents or other communities members' freedom and right to pursue whatever they want. Options, on the other hand, is the supply side of the equation. And we have challenges on both sides. So as an organization, we were committed to creating voucher initiatives, tax-free credits or incentives, charter schools, enhancing public schools. It's a very controversial kind of work to do because for the most part, no one's ever really competed with school districts in some places and forced them to kind of think about who they are and what they do. And so I'm not going to talk a whole lot about the supply side of it, but I'm slowly moving us in this conversation towards illuminating the challenges and opportunity around the demand side, and particularly as it pertains to leadership. And so the next step in the process was just understanding this whole notion of parent-consumer behavior. And so if we're really trying to reform the education system in general across America and produce higher student outcomes, one of the things that really struck me was how limited the feedback to schools are from the consumer standpoint. So once again, if we accept the fact that a lot of families aren't as sophisticated in their understanding of what goes into good schools and what they have to do in terms of holding schools and school officials accountable, and the role that they have to play in supporting them in creating these kind of schools, we found that the consumer piece of it in terms of the information flow, and that's the most important part of the concept as we're trying to refine it, is that consumer behavior means that information is flowing from the supply side, which is the school, to the customer, being the parents namely, and increasingly students if you're talking about high school age. And then they provide feedback about how well that's happening. And there's some free flow of exchange. There's a wonderful book that illuminates this topic a lot more than I can today, and it's called Exit, Voice, and Loyalty. Strongly encourage you all to read that. And essentially, what the author does is to show you that in the private sector, that there is no way you can stay in business if you don't understand your consumers' needs and what we call preferences. And anyone can come up with a list of needs, but with preferences, you force the consumer to rank order the things that they want. So apply that to education from two standpoints. You ask a lot of people, what do you want to go into, what do you want to see in a school? I want small class size. I want good teachers that are paid well. I want state-of-the-art facility, and a lot of other things. And then it's impossible to give them everything on that list. However, when you push parents to say, if you had to rank order which of these things you want now and which of the things that you'd be willing to delay until we can acquire more funding, we can mature as an institution, particularly talking about something like a charter school, which from the day that they're established to the day that they mature, it may take 10, 15 years. And so what parents will openly do is say, okay, let's rank order them. And they'll be patient about how it unfolds. And not enough of that happens. And as a result, parents in some cases, particularly with the public schools, because I think they're the classic breakdown in this exit, void, and loyalty model, in which if you are assigned a school, then choice has been taken away from you. And if that choice has not been given you, then you have not been extended an offer to be a consumer in the way that we think about it. And so we're still, through work that we've done in D.C., as Jay mentioned, Patrick Wolf and I are co-principal investigators of a project in D.C., a research effort in D.C., that is looking at the evolution of consumer behavior among about, well, the 1,300 families, poorest families in the District of Columbia, have been given what's called the Opportunity Scholarship Program. Two things that qualify them. Three things. One, they have to be a resident of the District of Columbia. Secondly, they have to be within 185% of poverty. And poverty in D.C. is defined as a family of four making no more than $32,000. And as anyone has ever lived or know much about the cost of living in D.C., $32,000 with a family of four doesn't buy you much of anything. And the third thing is that there was weighted towards families who had children attending some of the worst performing schools in D.C., and there's probably about 50% of the schools in the school district that are on that list. And so, you know, there are some concerns about creaming and other things associated with vouchers and some other cutting-edge education reform efforts, but I can guarantee you, at least at this point, that doesn't apply to these 1,300 families. These are families that were so far at the back of the line, and actually the mayor said it best. And when he crossed over and supported the effort to bring the federally funded program to D.C., he said that in his private meetings with parents, the question is often, particularly those that are low income, at the back of the line, so to speak, how long will it take for you to turn the school system around in a way that it will positively impact my child? And he said, you know, generally, he said, you know, it will take 2 or 3 years. And he said that was a politically correct thing to say. He said, but in his private meeting with his advisors and other people that would support him in that effort, he said it's going to take 10, maybe 15 years to completely turn around the system. And these parents are so far at the end of the line that essentially their children will have graduated before that kind of opportunity would be extended to them. So essentially he took people who are at the back of the line, and with the scholarship allowed them to go to one of 52, there are 110 private and independent schools in D.C. 52 agreed to participate in this program, and some of them are some of the better schools in the country. And so what we've attempted to do is to chronicle what it's like being on the margins of choice to being at center stage. And in these, generally speaking, and I can answer questions if you have them about some of the things that we're learning there. But for now, the only point I want to make is that it was just another step towards kind of understanding consumer behavior. And then the last thing that I'll say, just in terms of my practical experiences and how they lend themselves to some of the things that I will say in a few minutes, is that spilled over, once again, talking about the skew between the supply versus the demand side, is there's a huge dearth of leadership among parents and others in the community that will lead the charge from the demand or consumer side of the equation. So no fault to the supply side actors. In some cases, in many cases, there is a systematic attempt to keep parents on the margins. But I think that there are a lot of other situations in which people want parents and community members to be full-fledged partners. And so it's in those cases that I'm talking about that there are some challenges on the demand side. And to the best of my knowledge, there are only 2 organizations nationally. There may be some smaller ones, but 2 organizations nationally. One is the Pritchard Institute in Lexington, Kentucky, and the other one is called PK, Parents Institute for Quality Education in California, that are attempting to do this kind of work. So, one of the problems I would argue around education reform, as I've experienced it, is that there's not enough resources invested in making parents and community members something other than kind of token members of the kind of experience that we have to have across in and out of school time in order to have reach these academic outcomes that we all want for children. And so in D.C., quite recently, the Casey Foundation has provided some funding for me and some others to create something we call the District of Columbia Family Education Network. And what we've attempted to do there are in DC 125 organizations, not-for-profits, that say in whole or part they provide some type of service to parents. And it's a very balkanized community, mostly because there's a little funding and they're fighting viciously for it. And so there's been few opportunities for them to come together collectively and talk about how do they establish a presence in the school district that makes them a partner to be reckoned with, especially if they're not taken seriously. And that's been a huge challenge. And we can talk a little bit later about some of the things that, some of the reasons why they aren't more formidable in that respect. And so essentially, one of the points I want to make is we must find a greater leadership balance and continuity across all areas of a child's life. And I've also done a lot of work in the general area of out-of-school time, which aside from schools and parents or parent organizations, a lot of, and Beverly and I had a good conversation about this last night as well, where a lot of after-school programs that purport to provide academic and other support services to young people, in many cases are just providing daycare. And by any reasonable standard of whether they are somehow making a contribution to enhancing a child's academic progress, they're falling short. Versus a wonderful program, and she was sharing with me, that they're teaching young people chess or other things that are fun. I mean, so we're not talking about extending the day in a very draconian kind of way, but making it fun and enhancing and supporting what happens during the academic day. And not only outside the home, but inside the home as well. So that's another point that we can come back to at some point. And so one of the things I said here, and I've been harping on this point all along, leadership development is currently skewed in favor of school-based or supply-side stakeholders. And I think the politics around that and some other things are at play. I met with the chancellor today, and he shared something with me because Jay and I were talking to him, and he said something very interesting. You have to help me cite this, Jay. He said that there are roughly 365 school districts in Arkansas.
There were. It's come down a little bit.
Yeah. Do you want to?
We're now at
About 250.
250.
250.
But when he began, we began with over 300.
Yes, and and given the size of the population in the state, what that means is every one of these roughly 250 school districts are spending a disproportionate amount of resources collectively on overhead and some other things, as opposed to consolidating those resources and being able to devote more of those dollars to the classroom. I did some work. I have a lot of fun stories. I was part of a major school takeover effort in Pennsylvania, actually two of them. One was in a little town called Chester, Pennsylvania, which some would say is probably one of the second most challenged school districts outside of the Mississippi Delta and other parts of the Delta. And we did an analysis of the per pupil spending. And because of the politics and a lot of other things that were at play in that district, only 5 cents on a dollar made it into the classroom. About 60 cents on each dollar was for administrative central office overhead. And so that's one example of what I mean that's at play when you have so many school districts that are using money essentially in the same way. So there's some costs to be found and a lot of, some savings to be found in a lot of ways, and those funds can be redirected. And so one of the big arguments that I want to make today is that if we're truly talking about education reform in America, and certainly in places like Arkansas, then we've got to find a better balance between the two. And I don't think they're mutually exclusive. Because in fact, I think the ideal leadership approach would bring together in a more collaborative way. And Bev, I went on the website, I did not see that section you talked about. We can talk a little bit more about that. But it would be a collaboration between parent and other community leaders with school leadership. And so, we can talk more about how do you create this environment in a way that it just doesn't exist at the level that we need it to nationally. And it's just not happening. It's just not happening. Even the models, Pritchard and PK, a lot of what they're talking about in terms of leadership is really staying focused on the demand side. So not only do we need to beef up what's happening on the demand side in terms of leadership, but we have to kind of cross-fertilize and nurture relationships that allow there to be a lot more continuity and consistency. And so just use one example. I was reading School Reform's website, and I just basically cut and paste this segment of the description of the program. And I think, you know, this dichotomy between supply and demand isn't very conscious nationally. And it's historical, and Jen and I talked a little bit about it. It's not that, you know, in fairness to you all, that you're not open to some of the things that I'm saying, but I think it happens so subtly that it's just pervasive, and we never question it. And it's the second segment. By gathering a critical mass of leading researchers focused on education reform, the Department of Education Reform will be uniquely positioned to have a meaningful impact on education research and the quality of schools. You know, and I would just challenge us to think about it beyond just schools. And I thought the first segment of it was, you know, a lot more broad: policymakers, scholars, parents, teachers, administrators, and others. And I think that's a more of a reflection, but it just seemed like at the end kind of went back to our normal tendencies, you know, just to say schools. So that was the big thing I've noticed there, and I could cite all kinds of examples, and you know, I was hoping to find a good example on your website to share as well, but I couldn't find it. But it's, you know, it's not a criticism.
You couldn't find the material, not the good example.
Yeah. Plenty of good examples. I just couldn't find that material. So that is essentially the okay. I'm trying to do that. That's essentially, you know, what I wanted to share with you all, and I'm hoping we can have, you know, more of an exchange. And something I said you have some questions about. If you disagree with something I said, really would love to hear your thoughts about it. Want to expand something? I'm open to, and I know everyone else is, to kind of hearing something about that as well.
Well, I'll take the prerogative of the first question, just to get us going. Actually, I'll throw out two, if I can. One is that you're arguing for expanding choice because you see choice as empowering parents, that it gives them a stake in schools, makes them more responsible for success for their children in those schools, rather than simply assigning to others. But with expanded choice, we also get decentralization of school operations, I think. And as we get that, won't we get more of that administrative cost that you're worried about? So how would we reconcile the empowerment you want from expanded choices with the efficiency you want from greater consolidation? That's one question.
Okay.
And the second question is a lot of people say they want better integration of school and community. They want this to be, they understand that both school and community are responsible to varying degrees for academic success, and they want both school and community working as a team for successful outcomes. But while everyone says it, it's not at all clear how one does it. So from your experiences, what does one do to actually get that?
Okay.
So maybe you want to start with the second one first.
Actually, the first one,
Okay.
if you don't mind.
Sure.
Because I mean, your point about expanding choice, I'm actually not a big proponent of expanding choice at this point, because you know, my experience has been that, you know, choice is being expanded almost in a reckless kind of way. I mean, and so there are a lot of folks, foundations in particular, that are really funding the expansion of charters and other initiatives. However, getting back to the whole notion of supply and demand, what we're hearing from parents is that the number of choices are expanding so much that it's overwhelming to me to figure out what's the best option for my child. And so, and particularly for people who've never had that kind of experience. And I don't think in this case it's a class related challenge. I mean, I think, even a middle class parent would tell you that, there's a lot of effort that goes in picking a good school, and there's a lot of energy that goes in getting your child into a school once you identify it, because there's roughly 100,000 schools in America. And I would argue only about 20% of them are schools that people have the wherewithal and the information to send their children to. So the other 80%, we're all trying to stay out of, if you've got information and resources. So I definitely think, we want to expand quality schools, but we have to do it in a way that it doesn't overwhelm the people that we hope will take advantage of those schools. And then you have to rephrase your second question for me. So make sure that...
How does one act? Everyone says they want to connect schools with communities and parents, but no one seems to be able to do it. So from your experience, what actually produces that? What works?
Yeah. That's another good question. I think a couple things are at play. One of the challenges with parent leadership compared to kind of supply side leadership is that parents, as we're learning, their experiences are fleeting. So if my child is in elementary school and I become a prominent member of that school's community in terms of leadership, when my child moves to middle school, I'm gone. And then high school, I'm moving on as well. So the voids are cyclical in terms of leadership in that respect. I think the other thing that we're learning is that parents want things packaged. And this is something that we're really, really trying to hone in on, is that there are probably a couple things. And you all can just even think about your own experiences, because one thing we all share as human beings living in America is time. It just seems like we have less of it. And so, and people want to demand more of it, on the other hand. And so, even with parents, there are a lot of things that we think they should do, whether individual parents or leaders, and the reality is they can't do it all. And so we think that there is some number of hours every year. We got to figure that out from a research perspective. What are the number of hours? Say, hypothetically, it's 50. I'm going to devote 50 hours a year to one particular child. And I can spread it any way you want me to. I can be a classroom monitor. I can chaperone school trips. I can do anything you want. But every time I do something, I'm deducting it from that 50. And so I can use it up early in the year. I can devote it later. Somehow, I think that's at play. And so that being said, we've got to figure out what are the most impactful moments on the school year that we should invite parents to be involved, and then what activities can we focus them on. And it could vary. I mean, some segment, probably a very large segment of parents would have a very low number of hours they would devote, and there's some parents, because they're stay-at-home moms or dads, and they have resources, they may have a much larger number. So we got to figure out opportunities for parents to contribute that's consistent with the time and other resources that they can devote. I think the third thing is just packaging. We talked a lot about this at Bayo, is packaging things that parents want. Beverly and I were talking about this again last night. Not only do they want quality education for their children, they want quality housing, they want quality employment, they want quality health care, and at different points in a year, they are being pulled and pushed in different directions to make those things priorities in their lives. So at the beginning of the school year, education could be it. At that point of the year when you're looking to transfer your child because they're leaving elementary to middle, it becomes a priority. And so if we can learn how to, when it's less of a priority, package it with something else that's more of a priority, so they don't have to go to multiple places for their needs. They can go to one place, and they may be looking for employment that day, but to have some information that they can pick up about schools or something else can help us maximize the time that they can devote. But that's a challenge. Yeah.
You mentioned a study earlier about rank ordering or preference. What exactly were the findings? In brief, what were the findings?
Yeah, that's another good question. What we did is we're in the third year of that study, and when we started out, like any other study that talks to parents, we tried to chronicle their experience from when did you hear about the Opportunity Scholarship Program, to once you heard about it, why did you become interested? Once you signed up for it, what were you looking for in the school that you selected? Once you selected the school, what did you find when you got there? And some of these questions overlap in terms of the way that they're phrased. And what we found is that, just looking at those 4 segments of their experience, which cover, like a 6-month period of time, from the time they heard about the program to the time that they enrolled their child and had been there for a couple weeks or so. And the things that they said were pretty consistent because they kept saying the same thing. I was looking for small class size. I was looking for something in close proximity to the school. And segment 2, and then they would say something very similar in segment 3. But then when we started in the second year, we said, we know that there's an approach called conjugate analysis, and it just forces you to rank order your preferences. So we would say, okay, this is the list you gave us last year. What we want you to do now is we're going to give each of you 3 choices. And want you to rank order out of this list of 8 things that you were looking for in school, the things that were most important to you. And then that's when it started to get really, really amazing. And then not only did they rank order them in year 2, but when they did it in year 3, they really started to change. Because, for example, in year 2, they said safety was huge. Because most of them had come from schools in which fighting and other forms of violence were very prevalent. And so more than, and actually academics rarely ever came up in any of the discussions. They just feel like if the environment is safe and has some other intangibles, that will come. And so safety was huge, smaller class size, and these were predominantly Black and Latino families. They wanted diversity. And somehow I think they have matured, and maybe it's something that they're reading or seeing in the rest of the world, that their children have to be exposed to other children in order to have a fair chance as adults. So that's what they said in year 2. So in year 3, and these in year 1 and 2, they really aren't consumers the way we like to really think about them. But we thought about around year 3, which is this past spring, that now they have enough hindsight to critique their own feedback to us very early on. So we would say to them, given what you know now, you could select the same school that your child attends, what information would you need? What factors would you look at? And then we said you only get 3 choices from the same list. And they would rank order them completely differently. And so, slightly different response to your question, but for us it was the first sign that there is something called consumerism that's at play. And the other thing that we talk about is that many of them came from what we call a client situation. And by client, the arrow points one way. This is the school your child is going to attend, that's it. As a consumer, the arrow points both ways. I extend an invitation to you, there's some exchange, and then we eventually come to some agreement about what it is that I'm going to get and what you're going to give me. And it's a social contract to some extent that just had never really existed for a lot of these families. Yes, sir.
I heard Bill Clinton say not too long ago in response to a question about why we're getting trouble improving schools. They're not very good at replicating success. And you mentioned a high school in Harlem where they're doing an extraordinary job, and 2 others within probably 8 to 10 blocks where they can't seem to get it right. Your experience in sort of working in these schools and school programs all the way to Pennsylvania, D.C., etc. What can we do that we can learn from that we can work with our public schools that are having difficulties? Dr. Elliott's done an admirable job working in that whole arena. But from your experience, what would you say are some key issues that we need to work on that we might replicate success in?
Yeah, that's a good question. I remember you touched a very sensitive nerve. When we started Seed, we started really small, 40 kids, and then we said we're going to get that right before we increase the entering class number in subsequent years. And I thought that was really the approach to take. But the downside of it was, you know, in a city where for every 40 kids that come to our school, there's another 4,000 that are eligible. You know, how do we serve more? And that's what inspired me to do school management, go that route. And I was surrounded by a lot of business types. And these guys want to go to scale quick. And I remember we went to a conference sponsored by the Department of Ed that talked about that. And they had the founders of KIPP. Most of you know KIPP schools. They had the founders of KIPP on this panel. And they took the same approach that we took at SEED. And people said, well, you know, you're citing these really positive outcomes for your kids in Houston and in your New York school, but how can you scale? And they threw rocks at those guys all day because they could not scale. And I kind of followed them for the next few years, and they just didn't budge. They really honed their model, got all the elements of it correct before they started to grow, and now they're just doing a phenomenal job. LearnNow and Edison, both the schools, even though I think Edison did a better job. LearnNow was really frightening for me because I was the face of the organization. I was the person that was going out convincing these parents, community leaders to support us. And back at the home office, they want to scale rapidly, but we hadn't gotten the model right. And so I think at the top of the list is you got to get the model right. And that takes time in an environment in which people want solutions tomorrow. And so somehow managing that process, and the worst part about it is, particularly talking about a school district, the biggest challenge is the superintendents. Their life expectancy is like 2.5 years. So you come in and you make some major changes. When we did the Philadelphia, what they call takeover, one of the things that we did is a lot of research. And across that school district, they have roughly 160 schools or so. And I was talking to Gary about this earlier this morning, is that we discovered they had over 100 reading curricula. At the highest level of the school district, they selected one curriculum for reading. And everyone in the school district was supposed to use it. And I was the new superintendent who selected that. But some of the teachers had seen 10, 15 superintendents come and go, and they liked the one the first superintendent had. And so they played lip service to, oh yeah, I'm using the one that the new superintendent wants, but the one that I was introduced to 15 years ago worked, I'm sticking with it. And so you get that. You know, you get a very fragmented effort. There were over 50 math curricula across the school district. So in fairness to existing school districts compared to a KIPP, they get to start from scratch. They get to build culture. They can be very methodical in picking their teachers. They tell folks we use a direct instruction. If you want another teaching method, pedagogy, then you have to go someplace else. So parents buy into it. They have very aware consumers, and they get what they sign up for. And so I think when you talk about existing school districts, it's a really tough deal, because so much of what needs to change is embedded in the culture and the policies and the practices, and trying to revamp those things is, I don't want to sign up for that kind of job. And I feel for superintendents who, every one of them has to come in with a reform mentality, but the obstacles are huge. I don't have an answer to that one, other than I can say, once again, based on the KIPP model, patience, get it right, having a lot of control over the ingredients that go into a quality school, and unfortunately that's not the kind of latitude a lot of school leaders, particularly superintendents and principals, have. Okay.
Tom, just a couple of quick things that one I really need help on, and another is just a question. Back to the schools you saw, the poor schools, and 60 cents out of the dollar went to administrative costs. The school budgets, granted that I've seen and worked with, are in Arkansas, but I don't understand how that you can have a 6. Are you not counting teacher salary? Are you counting teacher salary in that 60 cents out of a dollar?
Yes. And the teachers' salaries actually will go into that other 40%. So about another 35% would actually be for salaries, and that 5% or so, and then some other costs. Yeah, it was an ugly situation.
Okay. I can't imagine having a budget the ones I've seen, like 85% go to classroom salaries. So
Yeah.
that
Yeah, well, one of the things that, and that's a good question. I mean, there was so much corruption. That's what ended up happening.
Okay.
I mean, it appeared that 60% was going to central office overhead, if you look at the budget. But a big chunk of that was being siphoned off by people outside the school district.
Okay.
And so, in exchange for jobs and other things, contracts, people turned their heads to the budget. So essentially, that was why we were there.
Correct.
Was to take over the district and kind of restore some semblance of sanity. But there was a huge fight, and that was about people who were benefiting from that corrupt system.
And on the parents, the things you listed about getting parents involved in schools seem sort of menial jobs, like hall monitors and those kinds of things. What we're struggling with is how do we get parents truly involved in the decisions about the kids' education? How do we help principals and superintendents build those things? That's where we need help.
Yeah, yeah.
How do we do that?
Yeah, and I was using those examples, I agree, in a different way. That what we've talked about doing is creating a career track for people who want to pursue parent education leadership. So beyond supporting and advocating for their child, that they would essentially pursue a career that, because they did it so well for their children, that they would begin to expand what they do to serve a school or a school district. So when we talk about professional development and creating leadership opportunities for parents in that respect, we're talking about a whole
so that
different
could be a
role.
part of the school's curriculum, though, right?
I would argue that we would have to, once again, this distinction of supply and demand, is that we'd have to have some pretty rigid boundaries between, because PTAs, for example, could argue that they do that. But what we've learned in a lot of places, and most PTAs are led by teachers. Though there's a fair number of parents that are part of the membership, exactly.
Yeah.
And those teachers are paid to play that role. Parents are volunteers. So by having this leadership professional development track for parents, they get paid for it. They learn how to draft proposals and read budgets, and a lot of things. And public speaking is huge. We've done focus group with parents and an attempt to build. DC Family Education Network has a component of it that's called the parent leadership, and the goal is to identify 30 parents and other community members per year and take them through this leadership experience. And they receive a stipend. One of the things we learned is that employers would support it, but we'd have to give this employer some type of stipend to free up the time. So if this person's a clerical worker, whatever their role, that you can bring in a tent on the days that he or she may be in some kind of training or leadership development. And then that has to spill over to them being members of organizations that give them the kind of infrastructure to play this leadership role, and it can't be the PTA, is what we've argued. Yeah. So now there's a whole nother effort to create that kind of organization, and then networks of leaders and organizations that work very closely together.
Let me jump in with one last question, and then we'll wrap it up.
Okay.
You were earlier saying parents have limited time, and they have a lot of different demands on them and a lot of different interests. I mean, one of their interests is quality education for their children, but they also have interests in good employment and finding good housing and healthcare and whatever other demands are being placed on them or interests they wish to pursue. And so earlier you were suggesting that, look, if they have only very limited time available for school, we should basically not ask them to be involved all the time, because if we ask them all the time, they might waste their time on unproductive things. We should be very judicious about where it is that we actually ask them to be involved, because that will be more efficient use of their time. But just now you were suggesting the idea of maybe creating some sort of paid, that one of the ways of addressing limited time is expand their time by compensating parents in some ways, or having certain key leader parents be paid to play the role of community leaders. I've seen this actually occur in San Antonio, and I don't know if this exists elsewhere But unfortunately, it evolved into basically a patronage system, right? I mean, the way the political control of the board was maintained is that they handed out jobs, and the easiest job to hand out to people who required really no qualifications whatsoever, and whose work could not be monitored in any way, was parent involvement facilitator was the name of the job. And they'd give them out to people whose job essentially was to ensure that the board members got elected in the next election. They were full-time campaign workers, because no one could tell if they were doing anything else. So can schools really pay people? I mean, is it, it's like PTA, it becomes co-opted by the school institution as soon as the school institutionalizes it. And so is that really, is it?
Yeah, I'm actually saying the opposite.
Okay, you're saying the opposite.
Yeah, because once again, that's why this whole notion of demand and supply is so important. Because it can't be a supply side funded effort. So schools can't play that role. It's got to be something separate to create that boundary between the consumer and the producer. And that's like any major product in the private sector you can think of. I mean, they're consumer watchdog agencies that aren't hired by Chrysler. I mean, their goal is to monitor the automobile industry, and the day they cross that boundary to receive funds from any automobile maker, they've lost their credibility. And so, I mean, that's got to be an implicit feature of creating this kind of leadership. And so, but there isn't currently the kind of funding and other efforts that are necessary to make that happen. But I think as choice expands, what this leadership does, and in addition to kind of holding supply-side actors accountable, they're the ones that get really, really good at understanding the best way to make certain activities and resources more parent-friendly, more accessible. They become the credible sources of information, because we talk to a lot of parents. We say, where do you get your information from? And they say, this woman lives around the corner. She looks at the news all the time. We call them natural leaders is what we call them in this institute. She goes to all the city council meetings. She goes to all the board of ed meetings, and we know that she loves our children, and she's not taking money from someplace else, and that's who we go to. And so, she synthesizes, hours of information, and she tells us what she thinks, and I run with it. And we got a lot of that. And so, how do we create these kind of natural leaders to some extent? And some of them are already in the community, but they don't have formal training. Many of the potential leaders we talk to, their biggest fear about a leadership role is standing up in front of other people. And I can relate to that. I mean, there was a time when I was petrified at the thought of standing before more than two people I didn't know. And so I don't take public speaking lightly. And that prevents a lot of them from being as active as we need them to be in meetings, regardless of what habit they're wearing. I mean, they have a lot to offer, but they're terrified of speaking.
So a consumer reports for parents, but one that authentically comes from neighborhoods, but might be facilitated by nonprofits, donors, the government perhaps, but not the schools themselves.
Yes.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, barring any other questions, or if people have any other questions, they can come up and talk with Tom individually, but I want to...
I just have one comment.
Yeah.
Not a question. You asked why we're here.
Yes.
The intent for this whole business is to really expand our vision, to challenge our ideas, to think about new ways of doing business. And you've done an admirable job, I think.
Appreciate that. Appreciate that.
Here with this session. We're happy you're here and happy you chose to come to Arkansas. And who knows, over time, maybe this will be a more extended sort of relationship. So
Yeah.
thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming.